Now we are going to have a discussion on static modifier. Now I'm going to create a project. Click on File, New, Project, choose Console Application, click on Go, then click on Next, choose C, then Next, choose the project title for your project. In my case, the project name is My Project 1, as you can see over here. Click on Next, click on Finish, and finally your project is created. Click on this plus button over here, choose the main.c file. I'm going to change this code a little bit. After that, I'm going to write some piece of code. What I'm going to do here is, I'm going to call increment function 3 times in this code. This function is available in some other file. So I'm going to create this increment function in some other file by creating an empty file over here. Let's create an empty file. Click on yes because it asks you, do you want to add this new file in the active project? I'm going to click yes. And suppose I choose the name of this file as add.c and click on save. Click on OK. In this add.c file, I'm going to create the function increment. Let's see how I'm going to create this. Here you can see that I have created an increment function. Inside this function, I have written some lines of codes. The first line is nothing but creating a variable of integer type and assigning it a value 0. Then I'm incrementing this value. That means I'm incrementing this value by 1, as I'm going to do count plus 1, which is 0 plus 1, and I'm storing this value inside this variable only. And then what I did is I simply returned the value of count, and this value return means, as you can see over here, this function's return type is integer. I'm going to return an integer variable. This simply means that the code which is going to call this function, after performing some operations, it will return some value back to this function. That is the purpose of a function, you can say. We are going to have a lot of discussion on functions later on, but right now, this is the one thing you need to know. When I call this function, I simply transfer the control from this main function to this increment function, which might be available in some other file, and inside this function I perform certain kind of computation, and then I simply return the variable which contains some value, and this return value is coming back to this particular function code, and this thing is going to get replaced with that value, and it will get assigned to this value variable. I did this 3 times over here because what I want from this main function is that when I call this increment function, it will increment some value. As I initialize this variable to 0, it will get incremented to 1 and simply get returned back to this particular place and assigned to the value itself. Then what I'm going to do, I'm going to call this function again and increment the previous value that I had already incremented. That is 1. When I increment that value, this becomes 2, and the value returned would be 2 in that case, and stored in value variable. Then again, I'm going to perform the same thing, and this time the returned value would be 3, and I'm simply going to print this value. Let's see what happened when we try to print this value. We are expecting the value to be 3. Let's see what is going to be our output. Now this is something which is not expected, right? The value I'm getting is equals to 1, which is not at all expected. I'm expecting the value to be 3, but I'm getting output as equals to 1. But why I'm getting this output? Let's try to understand the code first. When I call this increment function, then my control transferred from this main function to this increment function. That means in other file add.c, which is there inside this project only, right? When I call this increment function, inside I defined this function, I have written a count variable and assigned it a value equals to 0 because this variable is of integer type and I assigned it an integer value. then what I did is I simply increment the value, right? Which means I did count plus 1, which is 0 plus 1, which is equals to 1 only, and the result is getting stored in the same variable count. After that, I simply return the count, which means my control will again transfer back to this particular increment function over here. That is my calling procedure. This is my called procedure. This is calling procedure. I'm going to give you all the details about the functions in later chapters. You just have to understand that how the flow will go on, right? So when I pass the value, this will be equal to 1 because I return count, which is now 1 after performing this operation. Now the 1 value is passed to this increment function, and finally this 1 is assigned to this variable value, right? What happened when we call this function again? When we call this function again, then you see that this variable is again created and assigned with the value equals to 0. Now this is what we need to recall from the previous lessons, that what is the meaning of automatic variable? This variable is local in this function, right? What does it really mean? When the function completes its execution, as in the previous case, when I call this function, this is what is called. After completion of this function means that this variable is destroyed, which contained the value is equals to 1. When I call back this function again, then variable is again created and assigned with the value 0 again. And if I try to increment this value, this 0 is getting incremented and not the previous 1 because that is lost. Variable is simply destroyed. So we won't be able to retain that value. And in this case also, I'll get 0 as a count value. And when I increment this, this will become 1 and assigned it to count variable. And simply return count. This case also 1 is returned. And when I come back to this function, value is equals to 1 is assigned. When I call this increment function once again, this again created as the previous count variable was destroyed. When I increment the value, this would be just 0 plus 1 again, and the count value is again equals to 1. And when I return the count, this is equal to 1 only. And I simply print the value as 1. That is what we are getting as an output, 1. I want to retain the previous value, right? Whenever I call the function again and again. The purpose of this main function is to increment the value of the previous value every time and simply print the value is equals to 3 instead of 1. Whenever I call this increment function, I would be able to retain previous value and not new value every time. So what I'm going to do in this case, I'm going to make a little change to this code. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to declare this variable as global instead of local variable to this particular scope. Now as you can see, I changed the code a little bit. I declared this variable as global instead of local to this function. Now what is the advantage you get from this variable? Let's see. But before that, you won't need to initialize it to 0 because we know this thing, when we won't initialize any value to this variable, then automatically it will be initialized to 0. Now what is the advantage you got from this? Let's try to build and run the code. You get value is equals to 3 now. This means I would be able to retain the value which was previously there, right? Now what is happening in this code? I had declared this variable as global variable, right? Now this variable is available to all the functions within this file as well as all the other files in this project, right? This is the meaning of global variable. So I simply use this global variable inside this increment function and I simply increment the value by 1, which was previously 0 automatically. You know this thing. When I increment this value to 1 and assign it to count variable once again, then I simply return value of count to this place. Now the value is equals to 1, right? Okay. Now when I again call this increment function, then this variable is not recreated, right? Why is it so? Because this variable is not within the scope of any function or any block. which get destroyed after the completion of the function. Here the function is completed, not the whole file is destroyed. Due to this reason, I would be able to retain the value which was previously equals to 1 and simply increment the value and return it. In this case, the count will be equal to 1 and not equals to 0 because the variable is not recreated. Note down this thing. Because this variable is global variable and it was never destroyed because the function finishes its execution and this variable is not the part of this function, therefore variable is not destroyed. We would be able to retain the value. I simply increment the value by 1, which now becomes 2, and simply return the count here in this function and assign it to value variable. You call this increment function once again, then again variable was not destroyed and I would be able to retain the value, and now this time it will become 3 and I simply return the value 3 to this increment function and then it would be assigned to this value. When I print this, I got my output is equals to 3. This is the advantage you get from a global variable. But there is one disadvantage as well. As we know this thing that this global variable is available not only to this file but to all the functions as well as all the files in this project, right? Now we know this thing that this global variable is not only available to this file but it is visible to all the other files which are available in this project. That means for main.c as well, this particular variable count is also visible. Now suppose I change this code a little bit and I'm going to declare an extern integer variable. By declaring a count variable as extern, I would be able to use this variable over here, right? What I'm going to do is, I'm going to simply use this variable and manipulate it a little bit. Here I increment the value by 3, right? Count value is simply after this function is equals to 3. Then I use this variable in this main function and I increment this value by 3 and assign this value to this value and simply print it. Then what would be the output? It is equals to 6, right? Because up till this point this is 3. When I increment it by 3, this will become 6. Now this is something which is not a good practice to do because this variable count is meant for this particular file only, right? Suppose there is one case that I don't want this count variable to be shared among other files. Then in that case, this is not a good practice because this variable is visible to all the other files as well. Now if I want to hide, I won't be able to do that because this variable is visible to all the other files. Therefore all the other files would be able to access it. Simply increment them and make some changes to them. Sometimes we don't want this thing. We simply want this variable to be there inside this file only. Suppose we want this thing that this variable should be visible within this particular file, you can say, and not outside of this file. Then in that case, we are simply putting a keyword in front of it which is called static. By putting a static keyword in front of this variable, now if I try to access this variable with the help of extern in this main.c file, then I won't be able to do that. And it will produce an error, undefined reference to count. Because now in this case, the count is not visible outside of this scope. This is visible to this file only. You can still use it over here, but you won't be able to call this variable with the help of extern keyword and simply use it in other file. Because now in this case, static is put in front of this variable. This is, you can say, main advantage of using static. Variable is still global, but now this is global within this particular file only and not to other files. By default, value initialized to this variable, like a global variable, is equals to 0 only. Suppose I comment this with the help of Ctrl+Shift+C. You can use this command to make comments, and here also I comment this out. Then if I run the code, then this would produce the answer equals to 3. which was there for the global variable as well. Now there is one more advantage that you get from this static variable. And the advantage is that even though this variable is declared globally and I would be able to retain its value, but when I declare it as local to this particular function, then also I would be able to retain the value. And that is the advantage, or you can say biggest advantage, of using static keyword in front of a variable. Let's see how we can do that. Now instead of declaring it as a global variable, I declared it as a local to this particular function over here. Here instead of integer count, now I'm having static int count. And as we know this thing, then when I place static keyword in front of this variable, the value is automatically initialized to 0. When I declared a local variable like integer count, in that case the value is initialized to garbage, right? We know this thing. Automatic variables are initialized with garbage values. In this case, the value initialized is equals to 0, even though it is local to this function. And if I try to execute this code, then what happened is that we would be able to retain the value and produce the output is equals to 3. And that is the advantage to be noted. Suppose we don't want to create this variable as global and we don't want it to be visible to other functions within this file. Then declaring it as a local to this function makes it visible within this function only, and the other functions within this file would not be able to see this variable. And that is the advantage you are getting from this static int count. Even though it is declared as a local variable to this function, still I would be able to retain its value because this variable is static in nature and it won't change. When I call this function once again, then this variable does not destroy. And that is the biggest advantage of using this variable with static keyword. Now there is one more point that I would like to mention. Suppose I initialized it to a constant value like 3. I save this file and I debug the code. Then the value we got is equals to 6, which is acceptable. Now suppose I declare another variable integer var is equals to 3. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign this variable to this count variable. Then what is going to be the output in this case? Here you can see you got an error. Initializer element is not constant. Here you initialize it to some variable, right? This variable count is initialized with a variable. Now this is one thing that we need to note. Always a static integer variable is assigned with a constant value and not a variable or any function. It must always be a constant value. Now here are the takeaways for this lesson. Static variable remains in memory even if it is declared within a block. On the other hand, automatic variable is destroyed after the completion of function in which it was declared. Static variable, if declared outside the scope of any function, will act like global variable, but only within the file in which it is declared. You can only assign a constant literal or value to a static variable, and you cannot be able to assign a variable to a static variable or a function return value to a static variable. Okay friends, this is it for now. See you in the next lecture. Bye bye.